All right, thank you again for being here. We're going to get started with our webinar. All right, so quickly just to go back, about Save the Manatee Club, we are a nonprofit organization and our mission is to protect manatees and their aquatic habitat for future generation. So the ways that we do this are increasing public awareness about manatees through education and outreach, funding research, rescue, rehab, and release of manatees, advocating for stronger protection measures, whether it be manatee protection zones or updating management plans, and supporting efforts internationally. So what is a manatee? A manatee is a fully aquatic marine mammal, meaning that they spend the entirety of their lives in the water. As a marine mammal, they have hair on their bodies. Every single one of the hairs on their bodies is a sensory hair called vibrissae, and they use these hairs to investigate their environment. They have live young and they produce milk, and you can see on the bottom left-hand corner a manatee calf nursing off of the auxiliary teats of the mother. They breathe air, and they are aquatic herbivores, so they eat over 60 different species of aquatic plants, and the majority of their diet comes from aquatic grasses like seagrass or eelgrass. Manatees can be found all throughout Florida, and I think this is one thing that people don't realize, especially when they're moving to Florida, that anywhere you can connect a coastal habitat, so any of our bays or estuaries or even on the beaches, to our inland waterways, rivers, springs, lakes, manatees can access unless there is some type of dam or other structure in the way. So manatees will be in Lake Okeechobee. They go all the way down the St. Johns River. So manatees really access every single waterway that they could possibly access in Florida. Manatees migrate. They regularly will move between springs and coastal habitats. It's super common to see manatees moving between these two habitats and see them with barnacles from a marine environment moving into a spring and then having those barnacles fall off. So there's regular movement between these two habitats. In the wintertime, manatees gather at warm water sites throughout the entire state of Florida. And they do this because they're actually not adapted to the tropics. So despite their shape, one might think that they have a lot of body fat, but compared to other marine mammals, they don't. They actually have a thin, incomplete layer of fat in their body, and they're not able to maintain their body temperature when water temperatures drop below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So manatees can get cold stress syndrome, which is similar to hypothermia, when they are exposed to cold water. So when a manatee doesn't access a power plant outflow or a spring or some other warm water site in the wintertime, they can get these white lesions on their body. The blood in their extremities will shunt away from their pectorals and their face, and they'll get cold stress. And there are manatees that need to be rescued because of cold stress every single winter. It is a very stressful time to be a manatee, but if they're able to be in warm water, then they likely will avoid cold stress. And then when the water temperature warms up in Florida, manatees are able to leave these warm water sites and distribute throughout the state, even going as far over as Texas and as far north as Massachusetts. Manatees have evolved to travel slowly over very long distances. It's important to understand manatee biology and the way that they have evolved to understand why they might have significant damage from being hit by a boat. So manatees move very slowly, and this is because they have a slow metabolism because they are herbivores. As an aquatic herbivore, manatees depend upon plants as the majority of their diet. They have to consume 10% of their body weight a day in plants in order to meet their energetic needs. And in order to get nutrients from those plants, because plants don't have a lot of nutrients, they have to have a very complex gut digestive system. It actually takes 7 days for food to pass through a manatee's digestive system. So manatees have evolved over time to be quite large and to have a large digestive system. In order to reduce energy costs, manatees will swim slowly over very long distances, typically cruising around 2 miles per hour, but they can burst at speeds up to 15 miles per hour. And they do have a lot of muscle, they just typically move very slowly. When manatees swim, they undulate their entire body and use their tail to swim in this motion, as you can see in the diagram on the upper right. And this makes them very efficient swimmers. Because they have a slow metabolism, they consume less energy per unit of time compared to other marine mammals, which allows them it allows them to conserve energy over these very long trips. And they have very large lungs, as you can see in the bottom diagram. They run along, the two lungs run along the length of their back. They're very large, and manatees are able to hold their breath for very long periods of time, up to 20 minutes. And it's typical to see a manatee come up for air, take 1 or 2 deep breaths, and then sink down to the bottom, and then sit and rest at the bottom for over 10 minutes at a time. These are the same adaptations that make manatees vulnerable to boat strikes. Because they spend so many hours a day feeding in shallow areas where aquatic plants grow, because aquatic plants have to be in shallow water to photosynthesize, manatees are often found in these shallow areas, and it's often difficult for them to access deeper water very quickly because they're in shallow areas in order to feed. Because they're slow moving, and they travel very long distances along the very same travel corridors that boaters use, it makes it difficult for them to get out of the way. And because manatees have their lungs along their back, they are always swimming in a horizontal position. So if a boat were to come and hit them across this way, it makes them very vulnerable to fractured ribs and punctured lungs. Manatees aren't able to turn their heads. They have to move their entire body in order to look behind them, and they're not able to look around because they only have 6 cervical vertebrae, unlike other mammals that have more. So while this shape makes them very efficient swimmers in the water, it makes it very difficult for them to see boats and to move out of the way. Some important facts as far as manatee watercraft. 25% of the yearly manatee mortality in Florida is from boat strikes alone. It's estimated that 96% of all manatees in Florida have a boat scar, and that includes calves. And a study that came out in 2020 looked at carcasses of manatees and found that 1 out of every 4 adult carcasses had over 10 different propeller scar patterns on their body, meaning that 1 in 4 adult manatees is hit upwards of 10 different times by boats in their lifetime. A lot of the time, it's not the propeller that causes the most damage to the animal. It is the blunt force trauma of the hull of the boat hitting the manatee and breaking their ribs. And now we're going to transfer over to Beth.
Thanks, Tiare. So I'm going to reiterate some of the facts that Tiare talked about. So one of the things that we hear about manatees, why do they get hit by boats? One of the questions is, are they able to hear boats? And the long story short is, yes, they can definitely hear boats. And this is what I'm showing you is an image of the manatee brain. The visual cortex is very small. And like Tiare talked about, they can't see very well to begin with. So it would make it difficult for them, particularly in turbid water, to be able to see boats coming. But what you do notice is the auditory region, which is huge, which means manatees have phenomenal hearing, which definitely means, and studies have shown, that when they do hear boats, they do tend to try to move and get out of the way of those boats, usually by swimming to deeper water. So was a study done, which Tiare talked about a little bit, how manatees couldn't turn very well because their cervical vertebrae, they only have 6 instead of the usual 7. So there was a study done at Mote Marine Laboratory, which kind of confirmed that it's very difficult for manatees to localize sounds from coming behind them. So what this study is showing you here in this image is showing you what these captive manatees had to do. So what they did was they stationed themselves inside of a stationing area where that blue dot is right there. Then they had speakers surrounding them at different angles. And then they would play sounds coming from each of those different speakers. And the manatee would have to choose which speaker the sound was coming from. And what they found was manatees were more accurate in determining where the sound was coming from when it was in front of them. And when the sound was coming from behind them, it was much harder for the manatee to determine where the sound was coming from. So this means that in any boat coming from behind a manatee, if a manatee is in front of a boat, it's going to be a lot harder for them to localize and determine exactly where this sound is coming from. Jerry also mentioned the anatomy of a boat strike and how the anatomy of a manatee blends itself into problems when they are being struck by boats. So as she stated, the lungs run along the length of the body. And as you can see in the lower image, they have these 16 to sorry, yeah, 16 to 19 ribs, which are basically along the length of these ribs. And it's usually where manatees get hit, right, along this area. And it usually punctures the rib or breaks the rib And unfortunately, these usually puncture the lung and cause issues with buoyancy, which is what we'll see here. So indicators of a boat strike, sometimes these animals are side swimming, and sometimes they're excessively buoyant, meaning they look like this balloon. They kind of stay up on top of the water column, and when they go down to submerge, they kind of pop back up, or sometimes they can't even submerge at all. And this makes them difficult. It makes it very difficult for them to get on the bottom of the water column to get to their food source. So this is something that necessitates them being rescued in a pretty rapid fashion. So what happens if you see a manatee side swimming or having trouble with their buoyancy? What you want to do is call FWC, and that's the number right there. And we'll talk about some of these other instances as well. If you see a dead or tagged or orphaned manatee, that you also want to notify FWC as well. You can also email or text if you'd like. And you can also use the VHF channel 16 on your radio. And it's also maybe helpful to store this number in your phone, put it on your boat, and that way it's readily accessible if you need to call in an injured manatee. So what about prop guards? This is another question that we get quite frequently. Why don't people have prop guards on their boat? Because these prop guards potentially protect manatees from getting, those scar patterns that we so commonly see in these animals. Well, these are only effective if you're actually following posted speed zones, because this cage right here actually acts as a blunt force object, meaning if you're going at a fast rate of speed, this could actually hit the animal and cause the same kind of damage as it would if they were being hit by the front of the boat. So these are only as effective for people who are actually traveling very slow speeds. So if you're traveling slow speeds and monitoring the zones that you're in, the manatee protection zones, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, these can be effective, right? But not if you're not obeying any posted speed signs in manatee habitat. So there are some federal and state manatee protections. We're going to talk about these a little bit. The Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which you may have seen a little bit about in the news lately. The Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act, which helps create those manatee protection zones, and manatee protection plans. So these are protection plans we have in 13 key counties where you tend to have large aggregations of manatees. And these manatee protection plans just actually give us information of boat siting, where you can actually build or not build new marinas in an area that is manatee habitat. So we don't want to put more boats in the water in areas where there are high aggregations of manatees. And these plans kind of spell that out, where you can and where you can't put new marinas. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act protects all marine mammals from take, and take is harm, harassment, or disturbance. So one of the things you don't want to do is attempt to feed any marine mammal, not just a manatee. It's harmful and it is illegal. We also want you to swim with, ride, pet, touch, or attempt to interact with marine mammals or sea turtles. This could potentially habituate them to human presence. You don't want to ever habituate any wild animal to human presence where they might not sense that not all humans have the best intentions, right? So you don't want to habituate them to human presence. What is harassment, right? That's a good question that many people they usually know don't feed or don't give water to manatees, but there's other things that can constitute harassment as well. So it's any act that has the potential to injure a marine mammal in the wild or disturb, but not necessarily injure, a mammal by disrupting behavioral patterns such as migration, breathing, nursing, breeding, feeding, or sheltering. So just to give an example, if you're in a boat and you see a manatee and you go up closer to see that manatee, you could potentially be altering its behavior. And maybe you're thinking the manatee is swimming along, doing its normal thing, but maybe that manatee is actually swimming to try and get away from the boat. How do you know the difference? And it's difficult, which is why one of my favorite taglines is don't chase, just chill. Just sit and let a manatee, if it wants to investigate you, it'll come up to you. But the best thing to do is sit and be cautious and give manatees, as well as all marine mammals, their space. So, like I said, give wildlife space. These are some of the Marine Mammal Protection Act guidelines, not just for manatees, but for many marine mammals. For whales, we want to remain at least 500 yards away. For North Atlantic right whales is what we do for those. Those are critically endangered, and you want to stay away from them and give them space. Sea turtles, at least 50 yards away. Dolphins and porpoises, again, 50 yards away. In some locations, the minimum distance may be 100 yards. It's always best to give animals space. And manatees, you want to remain an appropriate distance from manatees so that your presence does not interfere with their natural behaviors. So again, some really good guidelines for what we want to do when we see manatees. Look, don't touch manatees. Do not pursue or chase a manatee while you're swimming, snorkeling, diving, paddling, or operating a boat. Never poke, prod, or stab a manatee with your hands, feet, or any object. Give manatees space to move. Avoid isolating or singling out an individual manatee from its group, and definitely do not separate a cow and her calf. Particularly in noisy environments, cows and calves use sound to communicate, to stay in contact with one another. And if you get in between them and there's a lot of noise in the environment, it can be very difficult for them to find each other and reconnect. Keep your hands and objects to yourself. Don't attempt to snag, hook, hold, grab, pinch, or hit, or ride a manatee. Avoid excessive noise and splashing if a manatee appears nearby. Noise and activity may startle the animal, which may put it in harm's way. If the site you visit allows in-water activities near manatees, use snorkel gear and float at the surface of the water. The sound of bubbles from scuba gear or other devices may cause manatees to leave the area. And do not swim with, ride, pet, or touch, or attempt to interact with any marine mammals or sea turtles in the wild. And harassment is, just to underscore, it's anything that can cause any animal, not just a manatee, to change its natural behavior from what it would normally be doing. So we also want to watch out for manatee protection zones. These are zones where manatees are known to frequent, and we want to make sure that we follow these speed zones. It's the best way to protect manatees if you're in a boat. So boating zones in Florida waters protect humans, manatees, and other wildlife in their habitat. Some of these include boating speed zones. So they're boating safety zones, right? Some of these zones are critical wildlife areas where manatees need to stay warm. Seagrass protection zones. You want to protect the seagrass or their food source, and manatee zones and sanctuaries. Manatee protection zones usually indicate reduced speed or no access. So there's different kinds of speeds. Idle speed is the lowest speed needed to maintain steerage and forward motion, usually about 2 to 3 miles per hour. Little to no wake. Vessel must be completely settled in the water. The speed's about 5 to 7 miles per hour approximately, and no entry zones. People, vessels, and pets are prohibited within these areas, and this includes no fishing within these boundaries. So know your zone. There's manatee protection zones. They're found in most coastal counties in peninsular Florida and can be in fact seasonally or year-round. You can find specific maps at this website below at MyFWC. Some counties have established local manatee protection zones, so always watch for signs and know before you go. There's critical wildlife areas, and these are established to give wildlife the space for nesting, roosting, and foraging. These are all wildlife, not just manatees. Critical wildlife areas are clearly marked with signs or buoys to alert boaters to areas that are closed to public access. And people, pets, and vessels are prohibited from entering these areas when they're closed. Fishing and casting into the critical wildlife areas are also prohibited during closure periods. And one that you might be aware of is in Crystal River, where is a critical wildlife area where manatees go to aggregate during winter months, which you don't want to enter, particularly during winter months. And I think from here, we're going to play this video to give you some boater safety around manatees.
Hi, I'm Trinket, and I love to boat, and I also love manatees. Here's a few quick tips on what you can do to boat safely and watch out for manatees at the same time. Polarized sunglasses help to cut the glare to make it easier to see manatees in the water. Go slow in manatee habitats and obey the posted speed zones. Watch for manatee snouts as they come up for air and look for manatee footprints. A manatee footprint is a circular pattern that it makes on the top of the water when it swims. Before starting your boat, check around the propeller for manatees. While out on the water, remember to dispose of your trash and your fishing line properly so that manatees and other wildlife do not get entangled or injured by these items. Remember that it's against the law to feed or give water to manatees. Report a sick or injured manatee to the FWC at 1-888-404-3922. Did you know Save the Manatee Club provides free boating banners, decals, and waterway cards for boaters? Educate others about these tips so they can help you be on the lookout while boating.
It's a fun little video.
Hi.
Oops. And harassment, right? So defined by the Marine Mammal Protection Act as anything that causes a manatee to change their national behavior. You might have seen this gentleman, I guess this was last year, maybe a year or so ago, that used a stick to prod a manatee, which startled it and made it change its behavior. So harassment can be mild and accidental, from startling a manatee by floating over top of it, or to purposeful and malicious, like chasing, throwing things, pulling on their tail, things you don't want to do. Feeding and watering manatees is also considered harassment and illegal under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And why do we want to prevent harassment? So we talked about this just a little bit. Everything a manatee does, swimming, feeding, resting, it takes a lot of energy to them to do that. And Tiare talked about their low metabolic rate, right? When we disrupt these natural behaviors, we are potentially harming them, right? During winter, manatees need to keep warm. And if we startle them and they leave a warm water area, this could be detrimental to their health. Human behavior can cause a mother and a calf to be separated, and they may not reunite. And when we feed, water, or touch manatees, we're teaching them that humans aren't a threat. And some of us definitely are. And over time, they may lose their natural fear of people or boats, making them more likely to be hit by a boat. Even a manatee seems to like being touched. We must keep in mind what is best for them. And what we promote is passive observation. And then, you know what? I think I'm going to turn this over to Tiare to talk about passive observation.
Beth just got so excited to talk about harassment that she took my slide. But that's okay. Yeah, so we always recommend when you're out on the water, this includes boating, and especially when you're paddling, to watch wildlife from a distance. The best way to view wildlife in their natural habitat is by trying to give them enough space to not be startled by your being nearby. If a manatee changes their behavior when you're paddling near them, then that means you're likely too close. We always recommend passive observation, which we also call manatee manners, because it doesn't disturb the animal and allows them to continue doing what is biologically necessary. So whether that's the feeding or resting or drinking, and it provides no additional stress to the animal. It reduces the likelihood of separating a mother and calf. And a mother and calf pair, they're together for around 2 years. And during that time, a calf will learn all of the warm water sites that the mother goes to, what to feed on, where to go. And so that is an incredibly important bond that a calf can only get by staying with their mom. So it's incredibly important that they don't be separated. And keeping your distance doesn't habituate manatees to people, so it's less likely for them to want to go up to a boater and potentially get hit. So what does passive observation or manatee manners look like? If you're out kayaking, we always recommend that you keep at least 2 kayak lengths away whenever possible. You wouldn't want a wind to blow and blow your kayak over a resting animal and startle it. So you always want to have enough space to maneuver your vehicle, and that includes boats as well. Always don't approach any manatees, but if you are in the area, you want to keep your voice quiet and talk in whispers and reduce splashing. As Beth said, they have very excellent hearing, and because they have sensory hairs all over their body, they can feel the water currents and the splashing in the water, and that can disturb them. Don't ever paddle over manatees or surround them. If you see a manatee in the distance and you're paddling, stop what you're doing, pull your paddle out of the water, and wait to see what the manatee is doing. If they're feeding, then they'll likely stay feeding along the bank and you can give them distance. If they're actively swimming towards you, you can wait until they're out of the area. But just keep in mind what the animal is doing, because they're likely trying to do some type of behavior that they need to do to stay alive. So give them that space. If you have a manatee that does grab onto your paddleboard or your kayak, don't interact with them. They are doing it so they can get your attention, and we don't want to continue to habituate them to people. So if you just ignore them, they will get bored and go away. And that includes if they're rolling over and presenting their stomach to you. Don't reach out and touch them. We don't want to encourage this behavior because it brings them closer to people, closer to boats, and puts them in harm's way. And always remember to look but don't touch. We don't want to touch any wildlife, not just manatees. So we talked about this a little bit before, but if you're ever out on the water and you're wondering, does this animal look like it might be sick, need to be rescued? These are some things that we typically look out for. Like Beth had said before, if the animal looks bloated, like they have potentially air trapped somewhere, if they're trying to swim down and they pop up like a cork, or if they're trying to swim in a straight line and they're kind of tilted to the side, that can be a sign that they have been hit by a boat in the past and have some type of unresolved injury, trapped air, a punctured lung, and a manatee cannot survive in the wild with that type of injury, so they need to be rescued and go to rehabilitation. If you see any fresh wounds, pink or red, or if you see an injury and you're not sure, their scars typically heal white, but if you are ever concerned about an injury, it's always best to just call FWC. If you see an animal that is breathing very frequently, as I said before, manatees can take a few deep breaths and then sink down to the bottom. When they're feeding, they'll breathe every 3 to 5 minutes or so, but if you see an animal that is breathing very, very quickly, that can be a sign that they need to be rescued. Cold stress, we especially see this in the wintertime. The white lesions, they'll be thin, lethargic. If you're ever concerned, call FWC. And that also includes if you see a small calf alone, because calves cannot survive separated from their mother. So we've mentioned this before, but if you don't have it in your phone already, please add the FWC Wildlife Hotline into your phone, write it down. When you see a manatee that's distressed or injured or even dead, you want to call the hotline and it'll connect you to dispatch. And then from there you can report what you've seen, and you'll have an unknown number call you back. This is a biologist from FWC calling you back, and it's very important that you pick up that number. FWC has said that that is the most difficult part of the process, is people not realizing they're going to get a call back. So if you see that, please pick up the phone. FWC may ask you to stay near the animal, but don't get close enough to disturb the animal. Usually that number that they call you back on, you can text video or photos. So if you are able to get a picture or photo, and keep in mind what direction the animal might be moving. These animals can move dozens of miles per day, and so if you've seen them and they're actively swimming off into the distance, keep in mind what direction so you can tell FWC, because they might get a call later in the evening of that same animal that has moved quite a far distance away. Here's another way that you can report wildlife citations. Anything that you see, if you see a boater breaking a manatee zone, you can also report that to the wildlife hotline. And then if you happen to see a healthy manatee where you're not concerned about its behavior, you can submit any of those sightings to our manatee sighting form. It's available online. You can use the QR code, or you can look up Save the Manatee Club manatee sighting form, and in here you put the date and time you saw the animal. You can click your location on a map if you happen to be out and about when you fill out the form, or you can go back in and put in your address after, and then you can put in any photos you've taken, what behaviors you saw, and we use this to collect data, especially in areas that don't have as much foot traffic. So we know manatees are in the area, but without the data, it's hard to advocate for stronger protections for them. So submitting to this form is very helpful for us, and we do check every single one. And that's the end. Please put any of your questions in the Q&A and we'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Tiara. Thank you, Beth. All right, we'll wait a moment to see if we have any questions trickle in. There is not anything at the moment, but just in case you guys were interested, there was mention earlier that we do offer materials for boaters, which includes a boater safety packet, a banner, and we actually also offer dock signs for shoreline property owners. If you're interested in any of those materials and want to learn more, you can email education@savethemanatee.org.
And we also regularly help local municipalities and other people with trying to figure out how to create a manatee protection zone, or if you have any specific questions about a management plan, or you need someone who has a background in manatees to answer any of your questions, please feel free to contact us at conservation@savethemanatee. We'd be happy to answer your questions.